So the course that we're doing, I termed Triumphing Tragedy. And I want to be clear from the beginning that it's not just going to be about tragedy. A few people turned around to me at the end of the class last week and said, is this going to, the reality that we're in is so depressing as it is. If you're just going to feed us more depressing things, then I'm not sure I want to take the course. So I want to say from the beginning, those of you that don't know me, those of you that know me know that I'm very real, but I hope also I bring some hope and tikva and inspiring stuff as well. Those that don't know me, I will say it. The course is not just going to be about tragedy. Okay. The whole point of the course is that we are going to be really unpacking Torah narratives and understanding how they speak to us in this moment. And my belief is, and this is what we're doing as part of the introduction, my belief is that the Torah comes as a panacea, it comes as a way of giving us hope, of saying to us, not ignoring the fact of our humanity, not saying everything is fine. No, to be a human being means to struggle sometimes. To be a human being means that we come face to face with challenges. It means that life doesn't always offer us everything on a silver platter. That's not the way life works. Not on a personal level, not on a national level. Okay? And the Torah is attuned to that fact. But at the same time, the Torah also gives us tools for being able to grapple with these challenges, for being able to overcome them, for being able to build resilience. And that's what I want us to tap into. I want us to tap into the power of our tradition, the power of the Torah that says to us, yes, reality is not always what you expect it to be. But you as human beings have been given a divine gift of creativity, a divine gift of innovation, a divine gift of perspective and insight to be able to overcome the challenges that come before you. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this course. I just wanted to say that from the beginning. Last time we began the few weeks introductory classes are an introduction to, I think, the power of Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat. And what I tried and what we began to unpack last week, we listened to two beautiful songs. One, which was written after the 1972 war, after Yom Kippur War. It was written... 73. Sorry, 73. It was written in Bet Hashita, okay, by Bet Hashita kibbutz, which was a kibbutz that lost a lot of amazing, there are more sheets here for those that need. I will remind you, those of you that take sheets, please don't forget to bring them with you each week. Okay, we don't want to waste paper. If you have forgotten them, you can also upload them from the cloud. If you're registered to the course, everything is on the cloud. You will get a link to the cloud. You will have the sheet. So if you forget them 1 week, you can literally access them from your phone in the class, and you will get all the recordings. Because the first 2 weeks are free, you can find the recordings on the Matan website from this week. This week and last week, you'll be able to find the recordings. And from next week, you will get an email with the cloud and the recordings, and you can watch them at your... I like to see everyone here every week, but obviously life throws us things. So if you can't be here, then obviously you can just go into the recording. That's the beauty of taking a course at Matan. Okay. Osher wasn't here, but I gave a promo. Okay, so I want to, so let me go back to what we're doing over last week, this week, and next week. We are as part of an introduction to the narratives we're going to do. What I'm trying to show you is the way in which I'm going to read the Torah. That's really what I've been trying to do. And what we focused on last time, so we began with a song that was written by Bet Hashita about the losses, because they had exponential losses in the Yom Kippur War. And one of the themes, or the theme of the song, was the idea of Hachita Somechet Shuv, the wheat will grow again. And then, fascinatingly enough, a recent song by Yishai Ribo called Porchim L'Shuvam also taps in to the same theme of the idea of Od Yismechu Ba'olam, the idea of growth, the idea of Sadot Hadasim, of the field that will grow again. And also, again, we're not going to go through the whole thing because we did it last time, but also this idea of how does one get through pain? How does one so-called triumph tragedy? And one of the things he also speaks about is this idea of emet, hadasim shel emet. And that's what I wanted us to begin to look at. I want us to understand how we can learn Torah in a time of crisis. And the reason why it's a challenge is because there's a part of Torah that is eternal, that is objective, that is absolute, okay? Which means that when we are learning Torah at a specific time, in a specific condition, at a specific location, okay, when we are learning Torah subjectively, there's a challenge. And that challenge says, well, hold on a minute. The author of the Torah, being God, wrote the Torah, and that Torah has, it's there, it's static. Okay, you take a Tanakh, okay, it is written, okay, these words are written down in black and white. They are static. There's nothing about these words that should be changed. And that is true. And that is truth. And that is a type of truth that we do need, that has stability, that is eternal. Okay, you would say, for example, science, or, science also develops, but definitely some forms of Greek philosophy, there are what are called propositional truths, truth statements that remain true no matter what. Okay, there's a part of Torah that remains true no matter what. It's fixed, it's black and white. God gave it to us as a corpus of our tradition that remains as it is. But the beauty of Judaism is that we have two parts of the Torah. We have Torah shebichtav, and if you write something down, that suggests an eternal, uncompromising truth. But there is also Torah shebaal peh. And Torah shebaal peh means what? Well, the very fact of an oral law means what? Means it's passed down from generation to generation, spoken. What happens? We all played that game in youth groups when you whisper something in the ear of someone else and then it goes to someone else, and by the time you go around the whole circle, what happens to that sentence?
Completely changed.
Completely changed. Okay? By giving us the oral law, Hashem, God, was saying to us that Torah, if it only remains up there, static, absolute, unchanging, eternal forever, then what happens as for human beings down here on earth? It becomes irrelevant. Thank you. Well done. My students at the front. We're going to learn about the front of the class and the back of the class in a minute when we look at the Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, of Moshe and Rabbi Akiva's class. It becomes irrelevant to a degree. Because why? It doesn't speak to me in my moment. And this is why, for me, this course is so important today. Because we are in crisis. We are living through an unprecedented moment in our Jewish history. Okay? We have never before had something like this. We can say we had the Holocaust, but that was before we had a sovereign state. Okay, this is, I'm not going to go through, we all know why this moment is unprecedented on so many different levels, and we are suffering. And there are questions. And I've heard many people say many different things, justified statements. Okay? What about the belief that we had in X? What about this? What about my relationship to God? How can I believe in God anymore when he lets something like this happen, etc., etc., etc. Many, many different questions from many different people in many different circumstances. Some of them with visceral losses, some of them only second or third circle losses. It doesn't matter. Everyone is grappling. And some people, their faith becomes stronger, and some people it becomes weaker. And everyone is justified. There's no right or wrong. And what I want to say is that's why Hashem gave us the oral tradition. Because there is something about the oral tradition that suggests that those impenetrable truths, those propositional statements, that black and white, has another dynamic to it, has another element to it. And that maybe truth in the Bible isn't necessarily what we imagine truth to be, because our minds have been so deeply influenced by Greek philosophy. And what I want to show you over the course of this class is the development of this notion of truth And specifically, I think, if you look at the sources, this notion of truth develops in response to crisis. Very often, and I'm going to show you as we go through, very often when there is a crisis, we are trying to hold on to a truth. We're trying to still grasp the truth, but there's something about the truth that becomes unhinged. And then what happens? And my suggestion is, if we actually go to the Bible, if we actually understand what truth is in the Bible, we'll understand why the Torah can be, should be, and is mandated to be a truth for us, even in the times where we feel as if the ground has been shaken. The ground has been literally pulled from under our feet. Okay? So that's where we began last time. And by the way, to go back to the two songs I brought, I believe that the wheat growing, the idea of the field, the idea of the sadeh is exactly the motif, exactly the imagery that we need at this moment. The idea of planting in the ground, waiting for something to grow. There's two things here that are going to be central to our understanding of truth according to Torah. One is the idea of process, and the second is the idea of a relationship, a partnership between man and God, where it isn't just God doing everything for us, and it isn't just man on his own, but it's a partnership. And that's what the field, that's what the sadeh, that's what the pardes represents in the Torah. It represents this partnership, this covenant between man and God, where they work together to bring truth. Last time we looked at the very famous midrash that when man was created, God, in order to create man, what does God do? He takes truth and throws it down to earth. Why? Because when man is created, in man's experience down on earth, there is a truth. Truth as a concept is kind of platonic, I guess, exists up there in heaven. But down here on earth, truth is shattered. Truth grows from the ground. That's what the Midrash says to us. Literally, again, the imagery of the earth. Truth grows from the ground, and from that, something is born. But it requires man to be a partner in uncovering that truth. Last time we finished, in fact, I need a sheet because I don't have.
We finished at number 5.
Number 5, okay. Yes, we were about to start Yoram Hazony. Yoram Hazony, okay, is an Israeli-American philosopher, a Bible scholar. He's the president of the Herzl Institute, and he actually also founded the Shalem Institute. If not, will you go and do you mind just going to the office and asking in the office, just tell them to make another 5. Hold on, who else needs still? 2, okay, so just tell them to do another 5. It's fine, it's fine.
You just asked one question. What is the name throughout our history that has allowed us to triumph? That's how you started number 6.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to talk about it in a second. Yoram Hazony, he has a brilliant book called The Philosophy of the Hebrew Scriptures. And in that book, he develops various ideas in the Bible, which according to him are not necessarily what we would think them to be. For example, he talks about the idea of knowledge. Okay, how we perceive or understand knowledge in Tanakh, or what knowledge is in Tanakh as opposed to what we perceive knowledge to be generally. Okay, and one of the things he speaks about is also the idea of truth. How is truth perceived in Tanakh, in the Bible, as opposed to the way that we generally understand the notion of truth? And his argument is, and he goes through a whole, I've only brought you a tiny extract, right? But obviously he has a whole essay on it. And he goes through a whole number of different sources where we see the notion of truth uncover itself in the Bible, in the Torah. And he says that the idea of truth in the Torah is not necessarily what we think, which is kind of, again, because Greek philosophy has kind of, and scientism and all the things that came with the Enlightenment has kind of formed a certain vision, a certain understanding of truth, which is like, if something is verifiable, if you're able to prove it, or if you're able to, see it, replicate it, whatever it happens to be, okay? He says, no, truth, actually, if you look at it from a biblical perspective, truth is the idea of loyalty, of commitment over time. If something is able to stand the test of time and be loyal and trustworthy, that's truth, okay? Listen to what he says, source number 6, the truth of objects is in the Bible a kind of reliability. And here's the word that I think is the most important word, steadfastness or faithfulness, to be able to rely on something, to be able to count on it. This seems to me to be at the heart of the truth in the Bible. Consider, it should say the 10th peg. Okay, this is what happens when you, I mean, it's an amazing thing. Modern technology, I'm able to scan on my iPhone, transform something from a text on a piece of paper to the text that goes into your Dapé Makarot, but sometimes it thingies there and I don't catch it, so apologies, okay? Consider the 10th peg again, okay? So he says the 10th peg, there's I can't remember exactly, I have to go back and look, but one of the sources he uses as emet is the idea of a 10th peg, okay? That is a peg that holds a tent, okay? Those of you can see those of you that don't go camping, okay? When one takes in one's hand before driving it into the ground, there is no way to know whether it can be relied upon or not. Alone, it has an expectation, or better yet, a hope of what that object will be able to do. One hopes that it will hold firm in the face of the stresses of the coming storm. Only after the fact, once the storm has passed, can one really say that the 10th peg was reliable, that it was true. Okay, so truth here for the 10th peg in the pasuk that he brings, and my bad that I didn't bring it, I'll bring it for next time, is that that the 10th peg is true if it's held, if it's remained steadfast through the test of time. In the same way, we know the seed is true only, and again, here he uses the imagery that the songs all use that we began with last time. We know that the seed is true only if it has grown into the vine we had hoped it would become. That a man is true only after he has withstood the temptation to corrupt judgment and so forth. In every case, we find that the truth or falsity of the object is something that cannot be determined when one first comes across it, but only once it has stood the test of time. Yirmiyahu does not present God as hoping the seed will remain or is in the face of time and circumstance. He hopes that it will be what he thinks a seed ought to be, which is to say something that grows into a desirable vine and not into a noxious weed. So God does like this. God turns around and says, what is true and what is reliable for God? Something that stands the test of time. When we're talking about a relationship, when we're talking about truth in relationships, relationship truth is something that stands, a relationship that stands the test of time. Does that mean that there will be no failures? No, absolutely not. It means there will be failures. There will be times where there are crises. There will be times where there are where there's adversity that we have to stand up to. But if that relationship stands the test of time, it is true. If the object stands the test of time in the Bible, it is true. Okay, if it does what it's meant to do, it is true. So there's something here about the idea that truth, biblical truth, is something that is not propositional, that isn't just black and white, kind of up there a statement. It's something about, and here's the key, it's something about living through time. Okay, truth is dependent on our experiences as a human being. And that's exactly why when the Midrash says take truth and throw it down to earth and it basically buries itself in the ground, it has to go through the process of growth. Growth happens when truth happens. Truth, how would I say it? The evolution of truth is when something goes through a process and stands the test of time. What does that mean? So again, we look at the idea of the written law and the oral law. There are certain components of our existence that are true, certain scientific truths. The Torah, as it is given to us, is true. Okay, why is it true? It's true because it's given to us in black and white from God. But there's another part of the truth of the Torah, and that depends on us. The Torah has to be true if it's still relevant to me today, 3,000 years after it was given, okay, if it's still relevant to me today. If it's still relevant to me today, then it's true. But how do I make it still relevant to me today? I have to be a partner in the evolution, not evolution, but in the kind of unpacking of the truth from the ground. Okay, let me go to the next source. This is Ha'emek Hadavar, and this again goes back to the notion of the oral and the written law. The reason God ordered Moshe to carve the second tablets was not because they're not worthy of a divine act. but to teach that the ever-renewing power of halakha given in the second tablet involves the active participation of the labor of human beings who, with divine aid, just as the second tablets were carved by Moshe and the writing was by God. Meaning there's something about the luchot, the second luchot, that are given to us with the acknowledgement of human fallibility. They acknowledge the fact that humans maybe cannot stand the test of time or the test of truth as being absolute. Human beings have to partner with God. Moshe has to help write the second luchot, and the second luchot stands in the ark with the first luchot. What are the first luchot? They're shattered. Why are they shattered? Because they were too perfect. Okay, truth in the Greek formation or in the Greek understanding, truth is perfection. In the biblical understanding of truth, it is not perfection, it's partnership. And partnership requires a space for human fallibility. It requires space for failing and starting again. It requires space for falsehood to a degree until truth is uncovered.
First created man, he had no part in his existence. So then once he was with our had to be, work the land and have the problem of God.
100%. So I didn't bring that source in because I had too many, but that's where it begins. Gan Eden is the perfection. It is the, if you like, okay, if you want to compare it to what we've been doing, it's kind of the Greek perception of perfection. Okay, it's absolute. Everything is clear. Everything is black and white. There's no gray area. The minute they eat from the tree of knowledge, and again, I don't want to get, we're going to touch on it. We are going to touch a little bit on that narrative in 2 weeks' time when we begin the story of Adam and Chava. But when they eat from, again, so you should understand the Et Hadat. What is knowledge? Is knowledge something that's absolute, that's totally true, that's black and white? So no, because the minute humans eat from the tree of knowledge, what happens? They leave the absolute model of reality and they go into what? They go into the real world. And in the real world, the very first motif that we're given the motif that we see immediately that God conveys to man is the motif of covering. Man has to give birth and woman has to become pregnant. Again, you don't see the fetus, okay? Man has to work the land, plant seeds, which you can't see. And then again, the motif of the ground, of the planting, of the partnership, all of those things, it goes back to the notion that truth is a process. Everything about being exiled from Gan Eden, everything about it is buying into the idea of process, of things that are gray, that we are covered, that we're not certain about, and of partnership. Okay? Partnership between men and women, between God and man. So it goes, I very much see a parallel of the first and the second Luchot being the parallel to Gan Eden. Gan Eden and the exile from Gan Eden. It's a much bigger question, which we're going to look at when we look at the idea of the broken Luchot, because I think it's in itself is a profound lesson in how we integrate fragmentation into our lives. Okay, so we are going to unpack it, but I'll just say in one sentence that whenever I teach it, I bring in Sheryl Sandberg's book, Option B, okay? Because to me, we all dream of option A. We all dream of Gan Eden, and we all dream of the first Luchot and the direct relationship with God where everything is clear. That's the dream. But the reality is totally different. Why didn't God make that? Why didn't, in the end, we have the first Luchot? Because we're human beings. And that's exactly what Moshe says to God. You're expecting too much. right? You think that you can have that direct relationship with the people without Hashem, Karachim, V'chanun, Erech Hapayim, V'rav Chesed Ve'emet, without that, it's not going to work. Why? Because you create, God, Moshe even says, you know your people, you created them. You know that humans can't stand that. You tried already once in Gan Eden, it didn't work. Okay? You tried it before the destruction of the world with Noah, it didn't work. Like, you created a creature that you want partnership with. That means you have to give into human fallibility. Right? But it also, and that means what? It means that there will be failures. It means that there will be a world that isn't ideal. It means that human existence will not be ideal. And then the question is, how do we allow for a growth towards the ideal, always moving towards the ideal in a world that is option B? Okay, so these are big questions. Again, part of the course is to grapple with all of these. Yeah.
So God knew that he was going to create a creature that is not big.
Okay, I don't want to get into here the idea of what God knows and doesn't know, God knowledge, foreknowledge, providence. It's way too big a subject, which requires an entire year course. Okay. We are going to read, I'm telling you how we're going to, I've said this already in the past many times when I've taught in the past. We are going to read God from the biblical perspective. Okay, which means what? Yes, God is portrayed with human character traits. Okay, does God really have human character traits? Did God really not know what was going to be? He's got full knowledge. How's it possible? I don't have answers to that. Okay, I don't think anyone has answers to that. The Greek philosophers totally dislocated God from humans, made God into an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, omni. The problem with that is what? God is all powerful, all knowing, all perfect, but what? He's not a partner. He's not a partner because I can't relate to him. Okay. In the Bible, God regrets what he does. He doesn't necessarily know. How could he have not known that they were going to sin? Maybe he did, but he wanted them to. He's all of these things, okay, in the Bible. By the way, he is also omni in the Bible as well. He also has moments of being there. For example, it's chapter 1 of Sefer Bereshit and many other places where we see this all perfect God as well. Okay, but generally speaking, when we talk about God in the Bible, we're talking about God in relationship. The truth is, he's both. Okay, when you detach him totally, there's no personal relationship. When you have a personal relationship, he becomes an imperfect God, so to speak. The truth is that you can't, in our human cognition capacity, we can't hold both together because it's very difficult because it contradicts each other. But the truth is, God is a contradiction. Okay, that's the answer. God is a contradiction.
No, but it's within the Tikkun Olam is a partnership.
I know, that's exactly my point. My point is that in the Bible, God wants us to partner with him. And therefore, if we are going to partner with God, we have to have a personal relationship with God, which is exactly why God in the Bible is portrayed in more human characteristics. Not necessarily because God is human character, but because in order for us to do what God wants in the world, we have to perceive of him in that way. It's going to be impossible for us to partner with God if we don't understand who we're partnering with. And at the same time, God is God. And it's difficult for, even in the davening, for example, when we say Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu is a contradiction in terms, hey, you can't be a father figure and a king. Okay? I'm saying that if you think about it from the perspective of humans as a cognitive exercise, okay, think about the characteristics of a king and how we relate to a king. Think about the characteristics of a father and how we relate to a father. To have them together is almost a contradiction in terms, but Chazal, and obviously we understand God to be both. Okay, so again, it's a massive topic, way too big for us. What we're going to do in our class is we are going to perceive of God through the biblical lens. Okay, there will be times we're going to talk about, of course, when we talk about the problem of evil, we're going to go back to the concept of God as being all knowing, all present, because obviously that's how we perceive of God. And then if God is all good, how can, right, if he's omnibenevolent, then how can there be evil in the world? And we're going to talk about that as well. Okay, but for the perspective of our course, it's going to really be looking God through the biblical lens. I'm going to keep your questions. I'm going to come back. I want to carry on. I want you to look at a very, very interesting midrash. And we're going to bring in here Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva really represents the character who he is the character that most represents the oral law. Okay, and I want us to see here something very interesting. Again, going back to the idea of the Romans and the Greeks and the way they perceived of God and the way they perceived of human beings, or the gods and human beings. So the wicked Taunus Rufus asked Rabbi Akiva, whose deeds are better, gods or human beings? What source is this? 8. Okay. Taunus Rufus asked, Rabbi Akiva said, human beings. Listen to what Rabbi Akiva said. Today, what would he be called? A heretic. Okay, he would. Right, whose deeds are better, gods or humans? What was that?
Maybe in the past.
Maybe not in our circles, but certainly in kind of traditional circles, yeah, to say human beings' deeds are better than God, no way. Okay, but that's what Rabbi Akiva replies. Turnus Rufus asked, behold, heaven and earth, can a human being create such as these? Rabbi Akiva replied, don't talk to me about things which are beyond a mortal creation's ability and that we have no control of. Rather ask about things that are found in humans. Now, again, that statement in itself deserves like a whole shiur to unpack, a whole class to unpack. Okay, what Rabbi Akiva, to me, it's a lesson in so many things. Okay, when our lives feel so out of control, when we look at things and we think, how are we ever going to perfect the world, or how are we ever going to, change the reality on the ground? Rabbi Akiva's even saying to us like this: we're not gods. We never have been, we never will be. What do we have? We have control over a certain sphere. And in that sphere where we have control, that's where we're asked to act. Okay? It's a yeah, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, exactly, right? That's the sphere in which we can ask, in which we act. Turnus Rufus asked him, why are you circumcised? Now again, why that question? It's a strange question. Why? Because for the Romans, the whole idea is that circumcision seems to be unnatural, right? They celebrate the natural body, the human body. Obviously, a lot of their gods were in nature, okay? But when you circumcise, what are you doing? You're actually turning around, you're saying what? You're saying what God has done is not perfect. But what really is, and we just had in last week's Parsha, Brit Ben Abataran and Brit Milah, which is like, if you think about it, what is Hashem asking Abraham to do? And it's amazing I think I mentioned this last time, but if we see the trajectory of the concept of covenant from Parashat Noach to Parashat Lech Lecha. In Parashat Noach, it's totally and utterly unilateral. God makes a covenant with humankind, but he doesn't ask humankind to do anything. In Parashat Lech Lecha, what happens? He's looking for partnership. He says to Abraham, I'm going to make a covenant with you, but you have a role to play as well. Even in the actual covenant ceremony, okay, which is the cutting of the carcasses and Abraham walking through, and then obviously Brit Milah, humans have a role to play. But not just that. God says to Abraham, you have to follow Derech Hashem Lasot Tzedakah Mishpat. You've got to do tzedakah or mishpat. You have to take my message into the world. There is a there's a sudden kind of pivot in the concept of grit from something that was unilateral to something that's bilateral, to something that requires human action. And that's exactly what Turnus Rufus is saying. Why are you circumcised? Like, what's that about? And by the way, it's not by chance that the idea of circumcision was something that many cultures, even today, right, fought against and stopped, because it is the message we bring to the world. Brit Milah is literally, it symbolizes everything that the biblical Judaism, the concept, the idea, the radical philosophy of the Bible is the idea that human beings are partnering with God in perfecting the world. It was so radical in the ancient times that the Romans just couldn't wrap their heads around it. And what does Rabbi Akiva say? I knew you were going to ask me that. Therefore, I preempted you and said that human deeds are more pleasing than God's. And listen to the imagery. Watch and listen. Rabbi Akiva brought him sheaves of wheat and freshly baked rolls and said, these are God's works and these are humans. Are not these better than the sheaves? Okay, to go back to the imagery I brought you at the beginning in the songs and everything I said to you, the idea of the sadeh, of the pardes, of the field, okay, represents the idea of Brit, where God turns around, and Rabbi Akiva is saying exactly this. He's saying, God wants us to be the partners. He wants us to get to the final product. He wants us to be the ones to take the sheaves of wheat that God has given us and to make them into freshly baked rolls. Rabbi Akiva bought him raw flax and clothes from Bet Shan, known through the ancient world for the fine, delicate fabric and exquisite workmanship, and said, these are God's works, these are God's work, and these are the humans. Are these not better than the flax? Turnus Rufus replied to him, if God desires circumcision, why doesn't the baby leave the womb already circumcised? Rabbi Akiva answered, and why is he also born still attached to the umbilical cord? Doesn't the mother cut the cord? And why isn't the baby born circumcised? Because God gave Israel the Torah in order to shape them through fulfillment of the mitzvot. Okay? It's a beautiful idea. It makes me laugh. My husband hates salad dressing. And every time I put salad dressing on, when we have guests, I don't. But when we do, of course, salad without salad dressing is like, you can't serve salad without salad dressing. He always goes, if God wanted salad dressing, he would have made the salad with salad dressing. I'm like, okay. And if he wanted people to die, he wouldn't have created a surgeon like you are. Like, yes, no. Okay, the point is, right, that what Rabbi Akiva is saying here is very clear. Rabbi Akiva, and again, let's not forget, Rabbi Akiva's character is, he represents the oral law. We're going to see in a minute how much he represents the oral law. He, like Moshe represents Torah Shebichtav, Rabbi Akiva represents Torah Sheba'al Peh. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva turns around to the Romans and he says, yes, you worship nature, but we worship something above nature. Okay, if you think about so many of our Chagim, they're 8 days. 7 represents the natural cycle of the week. 8 represents something transcendent. What do we worship? We don't worship human beings, even though we know we have a role to play. We worship the Brit, the fact that we worship God and we believe that God has given us a role to play. We believe that there is something that overrides nature. Okay, I'll share with you that 2 days ago, my daughter graduated Bad Echad, which is officers training. She not yet an officer, she's got another 2 months, but it was very, like, we live in an Israeli community, and like they were all going on and on about graduation from Bad Echad. I didn't understand what they were talking about. Obviously, I was not born here, don't know anything. Like, it's a learning curve, right? And when I got there, I understood why everyone gets it. It's like very, very impressive, like everything about it. You have 1,000 soldiers, you don't see your kids, like, forget it, like 1,000, you're like trying to pick them out, impossible. And I literally stood there as you're watching these soldiers, and fascinating enough, one of the soldiers who actually happened to be standing, she did the course with my daughter, and my daughter was standing next to her. She's like, her face is blurred in all the pictures on the news channels. One of the soldiers was Liam Berger, who is Agam Berger's, the Khatufa's sister, the one of the Tatzpat Samiyot who was taken. So her twin sister completed the course, and she was standing next to my daughter. And I turned around to and they mentioned it obviously when whatever they were speaking. And I turned around to my husband and I said to him, this is the best of our people. Like, the fact that on the heels of everything they've been through, these kids, 1,000 kids, serious, they've chosen excellence in an army that they know failed them, okay? They know failed them, but instead of shaming and blaming, instead of giving up, instead of saying, it's not worth it, they've turned around and they've said, we are going to choose excellence to make it better, right? It always reminds me of Rabbi Sachs, the difference between optimism and hope. Optimism, it will be okay. Hope is, we will make it okay, okay? And that's Brit. And when I was standing there at Bad Echad, I just thought to myself, that this is why our people somehow always manage to triumph. What is it? And it's above nature. That's why I kept thinking, it's not natural, it's not logical for these kids, especially you think about the twin sister, the Khatufa, it's not logical for her to go now and to become an officer. Like, why would you do that? Okay, why would any of these kids do that? And the parents, and by the way, the parents spent Shabbat with Meital's Pluga, And Maytal said the mother in particular is like an unbelievable, it was like an unbelievably powerful Shabbat. And the point is here, I keep thinking about our people, that there's something about a call, a calling, a transcendence, a partnership with God. Now, for many of the, actually, there was a disproportionate amount of Dati people there, but which is interesting. But there are obviously plenty of Chilonim as well, who don't necessarily believe in God and don't, but you can see there is a feeling there that we are being called upon to partner with something, whatever that something is, right? And that is what Rabbi Akiva represents. Now, to go back to the oral Torah, this is exactly what the oral Torah is. The oral Torah says, God is telling us by giving us the oral law, by giving us the ability to interpret something eternal, he is saying to us, I need you. I need your subjective input. And yes, what does it mean? Of course, it means that God takes a chance. Of course, it means we might fail. Of course, there's an invitation to human fallibility, but it's also the only way we can grow. Listen to what, bringing in Rabbi Sachs, listen to what he says in Tehillah Fracture well. The movement from the awakening from above and the awakening from below is a basic structure of biblical time. Okay, to go back again to this idea of what is truth. Truth in the Bible is something that is born in the process of time and steadfastness. Little by little, as the story unfolds, God's miracle becomes fewer and the deeds of humans become more prominent. Biblical truth, okay, again, going back, a truth that cannot emerge at once, but only through the experience of formative events, is a movement from acts done by God for the sake of human beings to acts done by human beings for the sake of God. Now, again, we can see them in a microcosm in the Torah itself. You begin, for example, with God creating world in Bereshit, and the whole of the second half of Sefer Shemot and Vayikra is all about the building of the Mishkan, which is a home that humans build for God. Okay, only 2 chapters in Sefer Bereshit about the home that God builds for us, but a book and a half is about the home that we build for God. Why? The Mishkan was a temporary abode, and always there's the question of why is there so much detail given to this temporary, and which we knew in advance was going to be a temporary construct. Why is there so much tension? Because the message is the fundamental message of the Torah, that we are required to build a home down here for God. What it goes on down here is way more important than what goes on up there. Okay, and that's what Akiva understood and explained to the Romans, and that is what Rabbi Sachs is explaining, is the whole construct of the Bible. Nowhere is this more sharply expressed in the rabbinic understanding of the dual Torah, the written law and the oral law. According to tradition, the first tablets represent the written law. The second were accompanied by the oral tradition as well. Okay, so which even more so shows this difference between the first and the second Luchot. That the first Luchot really had no space, both in a literal way and in a metaphorical way, had no space for humanity. Only the second Luchot, there's space for human creativity, etc., etc. According to the 3rd century sage, Rabbi Yochanan, God made a covenant with Israel only on the basis of the oral law. As it says of the second tablets, the Lord said to Moshe, write these words down, for in accordance, literally, by the mouth of these words, I have made a covenant with you in Israel. Meaning the covenant is the oral law. The oral law represents the covenant. The written law is as we said, unilateral. God gives us the Torah, v'zeu. The oral law is where the bilateral covenant comes into play, because humans and God, humans draw on God's gift, which is the Torah, but they draw it in to their interpretive schema. Now, again, I don't want to get into here, and I'm sure people will ask, and probably ask the class ask as well, but what does that mean in terms of the creation of halakha? Because we know you've got to be careful, and what happens if you make a mistake and you go wrong? There's many, I mean, again, way beyond the scope of this course. And I'm also not a halachist at all, okay? So it's really beyond my sphere. But one thing I will say is, for sure there's going to be moments where we are going to go wrong. And when we think about the process and we think about halakha, I remember so clearly, I heard someone, I can't remember who was speaking, someone said that they asked Rav Riskin about, I think it was in the 1980s, and they said to him, you know, can women lane or for a Sefer Torah or whatever? It was like a question about women and halakha. I can't remember exactly what the question was. And Rav Riskin said, halachically, there is no problem at all. However, halakha isn't just about the black and white. Halakha is also about whether something whether it's the right moment for it to be born, and it will lachzik ma'amad, it will become steadfast, it will become something that stands the test of time. That's really that. And any halachic development, okay, has to be able to stand the test of time. And if the moment isn't right for it to be born, don't start it yet. Okay, and I thought that was such an amazing, Rav Riskin, who we know is one of the biggest proponents of kind of orthodox feminism in Judaism, he understood that there's so many different factors, but one of the main factors is something will become halacha if it stands the test of time. Okay, and I think that, so there's a lot to say here in that sense in terms of halachic development as well. The audacity with which the sages understood the concept of the oral law is unparalleled. The written word is divine, they believe, but its interpretation is human. God empowered his sages to make authoritative decisions on the meaning of the biblical text. They describe God debating matters of Jewish law with the angels in their chasmi on high and relying on human beings to clinch the argument. And this is exactly the Gemara that Rabbi Sachs is referring to. I'm not going to read the whole Gemara with you. I'm going to just read parts of it. Most of you know it. Okay, it's the Lo B'Shamayim Hi, the Tanur Shalachnai. There's a big argument that's going on amongst the sages, and whether or not an oven is pure or impure. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer comes along and he says, I'm going to convince you that my opinion is right. Okay, and he brings a carob tree, and he says the carob tree is going to prove that, and the carob tree is uprooted. Okay, and then the rabbis say you can't prove halacha from a carob tree, meaning what? You can't prove halacha from a miracle. We're not living in that time anymore. We're not living in the time that halacha is proved through miracles. Rabbi Eliezer then turns to them and says, if it's in my opinion, the stream will prove it, and the water in the stream goes in the opposite direction. And they said to him, no, you can't prove it from a stream. And then he says to them, if it's in my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall lean inwards and begin to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua tells the walls off. He scolds the walls, and he says to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement in the dispute? Okay, he's talking to this object of the walls, the miracle, so to speak. He's saying, you have no role here. Miracles have no role in Torah Shebaal Peh. Okay, and what happens? The walls kind of stay in the middle. They neither fall here nor fall here, because in deference to Rabbi Yehoshua, they don't straighten, and in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, they still remain leaning. Rabbi Eliezer turns around to them and says, if halacha is in accordance to my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice emerges and says, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha is in accordance with his opinion. Rabbi Yehoshua stands on his feet and he says, Lo b'shamayim. It's not in heaven. Okay? Then the Gemara continues. And it asks, what's the relevance of the phrase, it's not in heaven, in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyahu says, since the Torah is already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard the divine voice as you already wrote at Mount Sinai. And we go according to the majority, okay? Which is revolutionary. I just want you to think for a second how revolutionary. Now, again, there's no question that this entire story is a rabbinic polemic. Okay, if the rabbis at the time, what are they trying to do? We've got the destruction of the temple again. There is no bigger crisis since that time. There has never been a bigger crisis for Judaism. We can't understand, we can't comprehend it because we don't know what it is to have a temple, but the entire religious consciousness of the Jewish spirit, of the Jewish people, was wrapped up in temple worship. There wasn't tefillot, there wasn't bet midrashot, there wasn't Torah Shebaal Peh as we know it today. Okay, everything, my entire religious persona and my entire religious consciousness was wrapped up in temple worship. That's where everything was. And then the temple is gone and the land of Israel is gone. What happens to Judaism? We can't imagine of something, a bigger dislocation than that. Okay, and the rabbis come along and they say, it's not finished. It's not finished because we have Torah Shebaal Peh, because we have the ability to interpret the Torah according to our given circumstances. And at this present moment, our given circumstances are, we don't have a temple, we don't have the land, but we still have the spirit of Judaism and we still have the Torah. And therefore they need to really, really reinvent Judaism. They need to reinvent what the Torah means. And this turns around to them and says, we're not living anymore in a time of miracles. We're not living anymore in the time of a bat kol. of a heavenly voice. We're not living anymore in a time where we can turn to heaven and ask God what to do. No, we don't have prophets, we don't have a heavenly voice, we don't have the temple, and we don't have the land. We are living now in a rabbinic age. We don't realize, by the way, what a revolution that was for Judaism, okay? We are living in the time of rabbinic age, and in the time of rabbinic age, the majority rule. And now what do the rabbis do? The rabbis imagine what God says. What is going on in heaven at this time? Is God angry that they've basically defied his voice, his name, his word? What's he saying? Since the Gemara relates, years after Rabbi Natan encountered Eliyahu the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at the time when Rabbi Yoshua issued his declaration? Eliyahu said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, Nitzchuni banai, Nitzchuni banai, which they translate here as my children have defeated me. There's many translations, defeated me, triumphed me, whatever it happens to be. But I think there's a play on the words. Nitzchuni does mean to defeat, to triumph, whatever. But what other word is in it? Netzach, okay, which is eternal. My children are my eternal stamp in this world. Okay, there is something, yes, it's true. The eternity of the Torah depends on them. How is Judaism going to continue? It's going to continue through the oral law. That is how it's going to continue. The oral law allows the Torah Shabbat to speak to us in our moment. It allows it to be relevant for us today. And that is Netzach. That is eternal. Listen to what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says about this particular Agadah. It's impossible to understand the depth of these passages without recalling the historical background against which they are set. The Second Temple, as I already said, right, the Second Temple has been destroyed, Jerusalem's in ruins, Israel's in the Roman hands, and the regime has been brutal in suppressing Jewish life. There were no priests or sacrifices, kings or prophets, and with the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, no hope of an imminent recovery of Jewish independence. It was the greatest crisis in Jewish history. Yet out of it, the sages rescued a momentous dignity. They had nothing left except the Torah. Yet out of it, they fashioned a vehicle strong enough to sustain Jewish life in exile for almost 2,000 years. The Torah became, in Hein's telling phase, the portable homeland of the Jew. In the written Torah, God had given Israel his word, thank you, but in the oral Torah, he had given Israel the authority to interpret his word. In this idea, never far from the surface of rabbinic consciousness, the drama of biblical Judaism moved to its penultimate stage. The Father had empowered his children. They had internalized his word and made it theirs. The full weight of prophetic Judaism is contained and transcended in the words of Eliyahu to Rabbi Natan, my sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me. At that very moment, Jewry lost its place in the arena of history it found in a house of study. The dignity of mind and spirit that allowed the Jewish people to survive the humiliation of powerlessness and dispersion. Thus was hope rescued from tragedy. God wants his children to grow. And slowly, and again, note here the idea of process, slowly over the course of many centuries, effaces himself that they may do so. Jewish history begins in miracles, but culminates in human responsibility. What changes us is not what is done for us by God, but what we do in response to his call. And that's why I really, really believe. And today, by the way, we're in another crisis. If Torah sustained us through our 2,000-year journey in exile, we have to ask why today Jews are forgetting Torah. Hey, the crisis today is not a crisis of the lack of a land or the lack of a temple. The crisis today is a crisis that the Torah no longer speaks to us. Okay, the crisis today is that the Torah has lost its nitzchiyut, its eternal relevance. And that is a massive crisis. It's a crisis that we should all, every single one of us who believe in the power of the Torah, we should all be deeply concerned about. And the crisis is amongst religious and non-religious. Amongst both, there is, in the religious world, there is apathy, okay? There's kind of, yeah, okay, this is the status quo, whatever. And in the non-religious world, there's ignorance. And both of those, apathy and ignorance, are massive dangers to the sustainability of our people. Okay, and what Rabbi Sachs, in my opinion, at least what he does in his life, is to try, he always loved Lin-Miranda Manuel, who created Hamilton. Why? The musical Hamilton, because he admired him so much, because he took a peripheral story of American history, the founding fathers of America. No one had really heard of Hamilton. You'd heard of all the other founding fathers. He took a story that existed on the periphery, and by creative imagination, put it central in every American's mind by making it into a successful Broadway musical. That, to my mind, is what Rabbi Sacks wanted to do for Judaism. He wanted to take something that had become periphery, right? Even in the mindset of religious people, it was like, okay, yeah, I'm Jewish, I'll do what I need to do, but that's all. It doesn't really speak to me at this moment. And he wanted to make it speak to us today. That is the crisis. The crisis is apathy and ignorance. And the only remedy to that crisis is to do exactly what Rabbi Akiva does for the oral law, which is to make it, and what the rabbis do in this, which is to make it relevant phase, to say we as human beings have been given the ability to be creators, to be innovators, to be able to take the Torah and make it relevant. And that's what I want us to do as well today in this course, is to try and understand how the Torah can speak to us at this moment. Because if we do that, then the Torah really becomes eternal. There's really an eternal element to the Torah. I want to bring you in another Agadah, very, very famous Agadah. Okay, I'm sure most of you have heard of it, and I want to put a slightly different reading. I want to read it in a slightly different way. It's a very famous Agadah when Moshe Rabbeinu is being given the Torah up on Sinai, and God's delaying. There's a delay, okay? And Moshe turns around to God like, what's delaying you giving me the Torah? Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Ram, when Moshe Rabbeinu ascends to heaven, he found the Holy One tying crowns onto the letters of the Torah. Okay, and he says, really, we should read this in Hebrew, because the Hebrew is, I didn't bring you the Hebrew, which was a shame, but the Hebrew is important. I'll explain to you where I need you to know. He said to God, creator of the universe, who prevented you? What's preventing you, really? Mama kevotka, like what's preventing you? What's delaying you in giving me the Torah? God answers, there will be a person several generations from now, and Akiva, the son of Yosef, is his name. He will extrapolate innumerable halachot from each of the kol kots v'kots. That's what it is, okay? It's not even a crown. They call it a crown, but it's not a crown. A kots literally is almost like a thorn. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Moshe responds saying, Master of the universe, let me see him. Who is this? Who is this Rabbi Akiva? Like, wow, he's going to take what you're giving me now and he's going to extrapolate it and understand it. Hashem said, take us, lech, again, terrible translation. Oh, sorry, I didn't bring the Hebrew, really bad on my part. I didn't want to waste so much of it, but Master of the universe, let me see him. And God says, Chazor la'acharecha. That's the Hebrew, okay? Go back to yourself. My favorite film when I was growing up was Back to the Future. Whenever I read this Agadah, it always reminds me of Back to the Future. It's almost like, go back to the future, right? You're going back to the future, okay? Lech chazor mi'acharecha. Go back to yourself. What happens? Moshe finds himself in the 8th row again. The 8th row. What is 8? Above nature, okay, something transcendent, something that's eternal, something that allows us to tap into something that's beyond the here and the now, okay?
I'm sorry, what's the meaning of the word? I don't understand the concept of crowns.
Crowns?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you look on a Sefer Torah, not every letter, but many of the letters have like tarim, ketel, like a crown on it. Okay, there's in the Torah itself, in an actual Sefer Torah, every letter has also the simanim of how you read it, etc. That's what it's talking about. Okay, that you'll find there's something in the letter itself, in the Torah itself, that suggests there's more than just the written word. That there's something that we can read out from it. Okay, and that already is what Hashem is saying to Moshe. There's going to be an interpretive tradition that's going to come with the exact words that I'm giving you on black and white paper. Okay, so he says, Chazor la'acharecha, go to the 8th row. Now, who sits in the 8th row? The people who don't understand. Okay, nowadays in our kind of modern culture, you put the people who struggle at the front row, and not that you struggle, right? The people who struggle at the front row, and the people who, but in those days, the better you were, the nearer to the teacher you sat. So Rabbi Akiva's right at the back, he's in the 8th row. And he did not understand the content of what was being discussed. He became exasperated. And at one point in the class, however, a student asked Rabbi Akiva, what is the source of the law? To which the teacher responds, it's halakha that's transmitted from Moshe Sinai. And then it said the word in Hebrew is chazor, it's something like chazor, like Moshe was relieved. It's like he like took a breath of like relief. Moshe came before God and says, Master of the universe, you've got a man like him, i.e. like Rabbi Akiva, and you're giving me the Torah. God replied to him, Shtok, silent, this is what I want to do. Moshe said, Master of the universe, you show me the Torah, now show me his reward. Wow, look at this man, look how amazing he is, what is his reward? And then he steps, goes back to the future, and he's presented with an image of the Romans raking Rabbi Akiva's flesh with hot coals. Moshe said, Master of the universe, this is Torah. Zul Torah, Zul Zahra, this is the Torah, and this is its reward. God responded, Shtok, kachalai machshavoti, silent, this is what I've decided to do. Okay, it's a very, very difficult Agadah for many different reasons, but I want to just literally pick out 3 things here that I think are important for us. We're going to talk about the idea of reward and punishment and suffering and all of that. We're going to talk about that later in the course. Okay, for now, I want to talk about actually something slightly different. And that is the idea of the development of the oral law. Okay, there's I think one very important thing that postmodern literary thinkers brought to us is the idea of what they call the death of the author. Okay, which is very often when we read, or certainly maybe before they came along, when you read a book, what were you trying to do? I remember when we read Shakespeare in school, the teacher, I don't consider myself to be so old, so it wasn't that long ago, at least I don't, my kids will say that I was like centuries ago, but the author turned around and, the teacher turned around and said, what is Shakespeare trying to say? Hey, what is Shakespeare saying here? What is Shakespeare, what's his motive? What's his intention? What's his words? What's he saying? Okay, nowadays, when people read things, what do they say? In a postmodern reading, we don't ask about the intent of the author. Instead, we ask about how it affects the reader. Okay, and that's what postmodernism calls the death of the author. Okay, now again, as ever, Judaism stands, I believe, right, the Jewish view stands between both. And that is exactly the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Torah Shebechtav asks us to say, what does God want from me? What was God's intention? But the Torah Sheba'al Peh says, how does it apply to me in this moment? Okay, both a classic, traditional way of reading a text, but also a kind of a postmodern way of reading a text. It's not to say that we've killed God off, although in the previous Agadah, there was an element of killing God off. Lo b'shamayim, okay? We don't listen to Bakol. We're not interested in what God wanted or intended. We're interested in what? In how it speaks to us now, okay? But I believe that really, genuinely, the fact that we have Torah Sheba'al Peh and Torah Shebechtav means that we have both. And this, in many ways, is what God is saying to Moshe here. What God is saying to Moshe here is the idea that it's not so important. Moshe is sitting in the class and he's saying, this sounds like nonsense to me. It has no relation to the Torah God is giving me now on Har Sinai. Like, I don't understand anything. And then all of a sudden, Rabbi Akiva turns around and says, no, this was the Torah given to Moshe from Har Sinai. So then how can we equate it? And that is the answer. That's exactly the answer. The answer is that the Torah is given to us from God. The authority is God's authority. The Torah is God's Torah. But it's given to us in partnerships that we can become active members, active partners with God in bringing the Torah's relevancy to our moment. So that's the first thing I think is very, very important. The second thing is the idea of Yeridot Hadorot, right? Where we speak about the idea that in every generation, you know, the Torah is what we're one step removed from Sinai, and therefore we're lesser than the generations that came before, because those that were nearer to the moment of the giving of the Torah are much higher in spiritual and religious potency than we are. Okay, this midrash is a polemic against that, because what's it saying? It's saying that actually the Rabbi Akiva in some ways is greater than even Moshe. Okay, is greater than Moshe because he is taking the Torah and he's using his human capacity to interpret the Torah.
Was he punished?
He's not punished.
Rabbi
There's-
Akiva.
There's no punishment. There's not even an inkling of punishment there.
Why did it have to go through this?
That's another question, which I said we're not going to get into right now, but we are going to get into in the course. And that is the question of suffering. Why does Rabbi Akiva suffer? And now note God's response here. What does God say? Shtok, kachalai machshavati. Silence. I'm not giving you an answer. Okay. I believe that there's a final thing here, and this goes maybe a little bit to respond. I wouldn't say answer your question, but to respond to your question. And that is the idea that there's always two views of existence. There's the bird's eye view, okay, which is basically to take, if you imagine this is like, I always imagine like he's in this time, he's in the time machine, okay? What was it called in Back to the Future? The DeLorean, okay? He's in the DeLorean going back and forth. There's this like time, this like overarching where God sees everything, and there's like time doesn't exist. It's like, and then there's humans who are located in their particular moment in time. Now, as human beings, it's impossible for us to have a bird's eye view of humanity. We can't, because even if we wanted to, it would be impossible. We can read about the history, but it'd be impossible to us to truly understand. There's a brilliant book by Matt Haig about a man who's time traveled. You should look it up. I can't remember what it's called. No, not the Midnight Library. That's also a brilliant book. No, it's another one. It's another one where the guy goes, or maybe it's not by Matt Haig, maybe it's by, it doesn't matter. Where basically he's born into, he like goes back and forth. And what you realize when you read the book is that however much you're going to read history books and whatever, you're never going to understand. Like he speaks about, for example, the stench, the smell in ancient times. Like you couldn't imagine it. Now the people there were normal, it was normal for them, the smell, but for us as modern people who have baths and showers and whatever, you can't imagine the smell. So I'm saying it's impossible for us to, because we're humans, we are born into a certain time, a certain condition. We can try and understand, we can try and imagine it, but we never truly will. And I think that disjoint between the past, the present, and the future is what makes us human, okay? But it's also what makes us fallible. It's also why truth is localized sometimes. It's also why truth has to be something that plays out over time, okay? And that in many ways, the rabbinic insight is that what they're saying here in this Agadah is that the rabbis understand that they are constrained by time. They understand that not everything can be understood. And God turns around to Moshe and says, I'm not going to explain everything to you. He doesn't turn around and say Rabbi Akiva is being punished. Not at all, on the contrary. And he doesn't come around and explain why Rabbi Akiva is being punished. He doesn't even explain why Rabbi Akiva is interpreting something that Moshe doesn't understand. He shows him the facts. The facts are, Moshe says to him, show me this person you're going to give it to. He goes into his class, doesn't understand anything. And God says to him, that's how the Torah is going to develop. He then says to him, oh, wow, show me his rewards. He turns around, he shows him being raped, his flesh being raped by the Romans. He doesn't explain anything. He simply shows him that humans do not have a bird's eye view. And part of the fact that they don't have a bird's eye view means that there are things that they have to kind of bow to. There are certain things that we're never going to understand. Now, why is this important? It's important because I believe that Rabbi Akiva represents exactly the idea of process. Rabbi Akiva, the whole notion of Torah Sheba'al Peh is the idea that Torah plays out in time. The process of truth comes through time. The idea of the Torah being interpreted in each generation is time bound. And to understand that, what we have to do, and this is what we do have to do, is we have to acknowledge the fact that we are time bound. Acknowledge the fact that there are things we don't necessarily understand. Acknowledge the fact that it is upon us to interpret the eternal Torah according to our subjective time-bound conditions, our limitations. And that is why Rabbi Akiva is so great, because he does that. in the very, and with this we'll finish, in the very, very famous Agadah, Rabbi Akiva, and we've got many stories of Rabbi Akiva like this, but this is the most famous one. They're coming, he's with his contemporaries and they're coming down to the place of the destruction of the temple. And they come to Har Tzofim and they tear their clothes. And when they reach the Temple Mount, there's a fox that emerges. I'm reading from source number 13. I'm kind of ad-lib reading, okay? They all start tearing their clothes and crying, and Rabbi Akiva is laughing. And the sages turn around to him and they say, why are you laughing? And he says to them, why are you crying? And they said to him, but this is, and they quote a pasuk, right? This is the place that even when a non-Kohen comes near, they shall not be put to, near they shall be put to death, meaning it's such a holy place and there's a fox running out of it. Shouldn't we weep? And Rabbi Akiva replied, this is why I laugh. Because, and he quotes from Yeshayahu, I will take unto me and be faithful and witness to record Uriah the priest, Zechariah the son of Yeverchiyahu. Now that was the what was the connection between Uriah and Zechariah? Uriah was during the period of the first temple, Zechariah is during the period of the second temple. But the verse was making the prophecy of Zechariah dependent on the prophecy of Uriah. Uriah said Zion should be plowed, meaning he predicted the destruction of the temple, but Zechariah said old men and old women will sit in the place of Jerusalem. Until the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, I didn't know whether the prophecy of Zechariah was fulfilled. But now that the prophecy of Zechariah is fulfilled, of Uriah is fulfilled, I will know that the prophecy of Zechariah is fulfilled. They turn around to him and they say, you have consoled me, the words in Hebrew, Nachamuni, I can't remember, you've consoled us, you comforted us, you comforted us. What does Rabbi Akiva do? Two things I want to say here. Number one, Rabbi Akiva understands that that our entire existence is a localized existence. All of us exist in a certain condition, a certain place, in a certain time. But one of the things that allows us to find hope in tragedy, to overcome crisis, is to be able to zoom out. Now, we don't have the capacity to totally be able to zoom out. That's a godlike capacity and it's not within our capability. But we do have the capacity to take a step back, to see the big picture, to understand there's an arc of history that exists. That's what Rabbi Akiva does. The second thing he does, and for me this is the most profound, is that Rabbi Akiva interprets the Torah to give him comfort. He finds psukim, he finds way of understanding the Torah, of bringing two things together, of understanding that if the prophecy of Uriah is fulfilled, then the prophecy of Zechariah will be fulfilled, and bringing those two prophecies together and understanding they need to be juxtaposed, that requires creativity, it requires innovation, and it requires partnership. It requires the knowledge that God has given me the capacity to interpret his Torah in order to bring comfort to others, in order to bring comfort to myself and to the world. That is the power of Torah, and that is the power of Rabbi Akiva. The power of Rabbi Akiva is to recognize that he is a partner with God. He's a partner in bringing the oral law alive. He's a partner in allowing the oral law to have relevance to his moment in time. Rabbi Akiva, of everybody, okay, saw terrible, terrible things. He lost all his students, and then he started again. Rabbi Akiva is he is the paradigm of starting again. At the age of 40, he starts again. He is the ultimate interpreter. How does he start again? What are Rabbi Akiva's roots? He watches as water drops on a stone. Now, anyone who watches, and again, to me, this is exactly the idea of nature and supernatural, of understanding that by looking at our existence, by looking at nature, by looking at the empirical situation, we find ourselves in empirical data and facts on the ground, and interpreting them to transcend our existence. Rabbi Akiva looks at the two natural things in the world, water and a stone. Two of the most natural things and natural occurrence in the world. Water is tapping on the stone and the stone is slowly being corroded. Okay? Anyone would say, science. Anyone would say, that's what happens. What does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva turns around and he takes it as a metaphor for his life. He interprets it in his subjective situation. He finds meaning in a natural process, transcendent meaning in a natural process. And he turns around and he says, what? Just as the stone, just as the water, which is a malleable homer substance, is able to corrode the stone, so should the Torah be able to penetrate my heart. And he turns around to that moment and he says, I'm going back to learn at the age of 40. Okay, what does he do? Rabbi Akiva takes a normal, natural, scientific process and he interprets it to his moment, to his life, to his subjective existence, and he finds meaning in it. That is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is someone who finds meaning in things that look natural or things that seem to be, no hope. And he says, there's something more here. Yesh kan yoter mizeh, in the words of Hanan ben Ari, right? There's something more than what we see here. There's something more than what exists. And that is why he is the archetypical proponent, not just of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, but also of the idea of hope in Judaism, even though he came to such a terrible end. And we'll talk about that later as we go on. So with that I finish, we're going to come back and look at a few more sources and then finish with a very important song.
Right. What about the limits on interpretation?
There's for sure limits. I said that, but it's not. I'm not going to get into what those limits are because that's really not the scope of this class.
Yeah,
but of course there are limits, and of course there are going to be mistakes that are going to be made for sure.
And different people interpret it.
100%, and that's why Shivim Panim Torah.
Yeah.
That's what the rabbis tell us. 100%. And that's the danger.